By the early 1830s of the Common Era, organized armed resistance by Indigenous Tasmanians had largely collapsed. This did not occur because peace had been negotiated or justice achieved. It occurred because years of violence, displacement, and deprivation had destroyed the material conditions required for survival. The conflict that settlers later called the Black War had not ended in 1831 of the Common Era with the failure of the Black Line. It ended gradually, through exhaustion. After the Black Line campaign concluded in 1831 of the Common Era, colonial authorities abandoned the idea of large-scale military operations. Instead, they adopted a strategy of removal presented as protection. Indigenous survivors were described as endangered and in need of care. In reality, they were being isolated from their land and each other. Beginning in the early 1830s of the Common Era, Indigenous Tasmanians were encouraged, coerced, or forcibly transported away from the mainland of Tasmania. The central destination was Flinders Island, located in Bass Strait, several hundred kilometers from their traditional territories. Smaller groups were also sent to other offshore locations. This policy was framed as humanitarian. Colonial officials argued that separation would end violence and allow Indigenous people to survive under government supervision. The language of protection replaced the language of war. Yet the conditions created by removal proved deadly. On Flinders Island, Indigenous Tasmanians were confined to settlements where food was unfamiliar, shelter inadequate, and medical care insufficient. Traditional hunting and movement were impossible. People from different nations, with different languages and customs, were forced to live together under constant oversight. Disease spread rapidly through crowded camps. By the year 1835 of the Common Era, the indigenous population of Tasmania had declined to a fraction of its size at the time of British settlement in 1803 of the Common Era. Deaths from illness, despair, and malnutrition became common. Children and elders were particularly vulnerable. Survival itself became precarious. At the same time, colonial society began to reinterpret what had occurred. Violence faded from public view as Indigenous people disappeared from the landscape. Farms expanded. Roads were built. Settlements stabilized. The absence of conflict was presented as resolution. This reinterpretation laid the groundwork for a powerful myth. As Indigenous Tasmanians were removed from their land and confined to distant settlements, they were also removed from the colonial imagination. Their absence was explained not as the result of policy and violence, but as inevitability. Disease, decline, and extinction were offered as explanations that absolved the colony of responsibility. Yet Indigenous Tasmanians had not vanished. They survived in reduced numbers, under extraordinary pressure, and in conditions designed to erase continuity. Families persisted. Memory endured. Identity adapted. Survival was not evidence of benevolence. It was evidence of resilience. The years following the Black War represent one of the most misunderstood periods in Australian history. They are often described as an aftermath, a tragic epilogue to conflict. In reality, they were a continuation of the same process by different means. Violence gave way to confinement. Elimination gave way to management. By the year 1832 of the Common Era, the removal of Indigenous Tasmanians to Flinders Island had become the central policy of the colonial government. What had been presented as a temporary measure quickly hardened into a permanent system of confinement. The settlement established there was known as Wybalenna, a name that would later become synonymous with suffering. Wybalenna was administered under the authority of colonial officials and missionaries, who claimed that isolation would protect Indigenous people from further violence. In practice, the settlement functioned as a place of control. Movement was restricted. Daily life was regulated. Traditional practices were discouraged or forbidden. The environment itself proved hostile. Flinders Island differed significantly from the lands Indigenous Tasmanians had known for generations. Food sources were unfamiliar. Hunting and fishing were limited by rules imposed by authorities. Rations provided by the settlement were often inadequate in both quantity and nutritional value. Housing consisted of poorly constructed buildings that offered little protection from cold and damp conditions. Disease spread rapidly. Between approximately 1832 and 1847 of the Common Era, outbreaks of influenza, respiratory illness, and other infections devastated the population. Medical care was minimal, and understanding of disease transmission was limited. Overcrowding worsened conditions. Mortality rates remained extremely high year after year. By the late 1830s of the Common Era, death had become a constant presence at Wybalenna. Burial grounds expanded. Entire family lines disappeared. Children grew up surrounded by loss. Despair and depression were widely reported, though rarely acknowledged as consequences of policy. Colonial authorities interpreted this decline through a lens of inevitability. Rather than questioning the conditions they had created, officials argued that Indigenous Tasmanians were naturally dying out. This narrative served a clear purpose. If extinction was inevitable, then policy required no accountability. Violence and removal could be reframed as unfortunate but unavoidable. Yet records from the period reveal a different reality. Indigenous Tasmanians repeatedly expressed grief over separation from their land. They resisted attempts to abandon language and ceremony. They asked to return home. These requests were denied. Protection, as practiced, was not about survival on Indigenous terms. It was about containment. By the year 1847 of the Common Era, the failure of Wybalenna was undeniable. The population had collapsed to fewer than 50 individuals. The settlement was formally closed, and the remaining survivors were transferred again, this time to Oyster Cove, south of Hobart. This relocation did not mark improvement. Conditions at Oyster Cove were marginally less isolated, but resources remained limited. Survivors were now entirely dependent on colonial authorities. Their visibility within settler society reinforced the emerging myth that Indigenous Tasmanians represented the last remnants of a vanishing people. Throughout the 1840s and 1850s of the Common Era, this myth took hold. Newspapers, officials, and scholars began to speak openly of extinction. Indigenous Tasmanians were described as relics of the past rather than as living communities. Their survival was treated as an anomaly rather than as evidence of resilience. Protection had achieved its unspoken goal. By removing Indigenous people from their land, fragmenting communities, and controlling reproduction and movement, the colonial state had effectively eliminated resistance without declaring war. The absence of Indigenous Tasmanians from the landscape was used to justify the belief that they no longer existed as a people. By the middle of the 19th century of the Common Era, the colonial narrative surrounding Indigenous Tasmanians had hardened into a dangerous certainty. As the number of visible Indigenous people declined, settlers and officials increasingly described this outcome not as the result of violence and policy, but as a natural and inevitable disappearance. Thus emerged one of the most enduring myths in Australian history, the belief that the Indigenous peoples of Tasmania had become extinct. This belief did not arise from ignorance. It was constructed. Colonial authorities were fully aware of the policies that had led to population collapse. They had overseen removal, confinement, and control. They had documented illness, despair, and death at Wybalenna and Oyster Cove. Yet acknowledging responsibility would have required confronting the moral and legal foundations of settlement. Extinction provided a convenient alternative explanation. Newspapers in the 1840s and 1850s of the Common Era regularly referred to Indigenous Tasmanians as the last of their race. Scholars and officials wrote as though Indigenous culture belonged exclusively to the past. Museums collected remains and artifacts, treating living people as objects of study rather than as members of a continuing society. This narrative served multiple purposes. It absolved the colony of responsibility for violence and removal. It transformed genocide into tragedy. It allowed settler society to imagine itself as humane, even as it benefited from dispossession. Most importantly, it erased Indigenous claims to land by denying Indigenous existence altogether. Yet Indigenous Tasmanians did not vanish. Despite catastrophic loss, survivors maintained family lines, memory, and identity. They adapted to new conditions, formed new communities, and preserved cultural knowledge in ways that colonial observers either dismissed or refused to see. Survival did not fit the extinction narrative, so it was ignored. The myth persisted well into the 20th century of the Common Era. School textbooks repeated it. Public monuments reinforced it. Academic works treated Indigenous Tasmanians as a completed chapter. This erasure compounded the original violence by denying descendants recognition as Indigenous people. Challenging this myth required sustained effort. From the mid-20th century of the Common Era onward, Indigenous Tasmanians began to assert their identity publicly. They challenged historical accounts, reclaimed language and culture, and demanded recognition of survival. Historians revisited archival records, exposing how extinction had been manufactured through policy and neglect rather than biology. These efforts revealed the continuity that colonial narratives had denied. Recognition came slowly and unevenly. Some institutions resisted, clinging to outdated definitions of identity tied to colonial classification. Others acknowledged that Indigenous Tasmanians had always existed, even when forced into invisibility. The myth of extinction did not collapse overnight. It eroded through evidence, testimony, and persistence. Understanding this myth is essential to understanding Tasmania's frontier history. Violence alone did not erase Indigenous Tasmanians. Erasure was completed through narrative. By declaring a people extinct, colonial society attempted to close the moral ledger without accounting for its actions. The story of Tasmania after the Black War is therefore not only a story of loss. It is also a story of survival against overwhelming odds. Indigenous Tasmanians endured not because they were protected, but because they resisted disappearance itself. This is why the frontier wars in Tasmania cannot be confined to the battlefield or the Black Line. Their consequences extended into memory, identity, and national history. The war did not end when resistance collapsed. It continued through silence.